I too cannot wait for another talk on mediKanren. This is the third talk on mediKanren this week, I think. So Nada gave a PLMW talk. Matt just gave the keynote. And I'm going to talk about, hopefully, avoid a whole lot of overlap, because I know a fair number of people saw Nada's PLMW talk as well. So I'd like to talk more about maybe the nitty-gritties of mediKanren, and I will attempt to give my own answer to Dimitri's question, because other people have asked this question as well about why mediKanren instead of Prolog or some other choice. So I will address that as well. I would like to make this highly interactive, so feel free to interrupt me if you have a question or want to talk about something. Okay, so but first of all, I have to do the official part, so everyone is happy. The most complicated part of doing any sort of slide on a giant consortium is doing these first two slides. So first of all, here are all the people currently involved right this second, doing things involving mediKanren, or who before they left the Precision Medicine Institute, you call Precision Medicine Institute, UAB, were contributing to the design or development of mediKanren. So we've got quite a few people. The number of people has grown tremendously recently, since we finally finished the initial phase, the phase to try to figure out if such a reasoner could even be built. Once the NIH was convinced that this was possible, they've funded development for a second phase, actual development of these reasoners as part of the NCAT's biomedical data translator project. And recently, largely because of Nada Min bringing in her friends, we've got a whole bunch of new faces who are interested in trying to improve reasoning on mediKanren, which is very exciting. I'll talk a little bit about that. So, research in this publication, our talk, is supported by the National Center for Advanced and Translational Sciences and the National Institute of Health under various grants, and anything I say doesn't necessarily represent the opinion of the National Institute of Health or the federal government. All right, now we're done. We can talk about whatever we want. So I can talk a little bit about NCATs and why it's interesting, and you've probably heard a little bit about the project, but I'll just want to say, in my mind, the point of this project is to try to wrestle with the main sources of biomedical data and put them in enough of a standardized format that we can run queries over the data sources, and we can start doing reasoning. And the reason this is tricky is that they're on the order of 1 million publications a year. There are all sorts of databases that have existed since the 1960s, like OMIM. And none of these databases in general were designed to work with any of the others. They use different controlled vocabularies and nomenclatures and ontologies and so forth. So that's part of the big problem. And so, the project's really about a couple things. First of all, being able to get the data in a shape where we can even do simple queries over them, and also being able to do advanced reasoning. So one of the pieces of secret sauce that has been developed during this project, and I think actually part of it was developed before that, is what's called the Biolink Model. So the Biolink Model is an attempt to establish a data model in which we can talk about the main concepts of biology, medicine, chemistry. And so you can see that we can refer to concepts like genes and diseases, pathways, so forth. So if I click on genes, we'll see that in the data sources we currently have on the project, there are a whole bunch of different prefixes you can have for an identifier representing a concept having to do with the gene. Okay, so this is what we call curries, which are basically sort of semantic web type shortened URLs that can uniquely identify a concept. And so these are identifier prefixes having to do with genes in the project. Turns out that there are more. And so a big part of the project is even just being able to talk about a specific concept and then saying, knowing that we want to talk about a specific gene, what are all the related genes? And there are many types of naming. And this, by the way, can cause a lot of problems when you have natural language processing involved. And so one of the problems that I will remember that happened in Precision Medicine Institute, I don't know if Matt, if you told this story, but we were using a data source called semantic medline, which is very useful. It has about 100 million assertions about medicine and biology and chemistry, taken from about the abstracts of about 20 million papers. And we had a patient with a rare disease and a certain gene. We're trying to find ways to modulate that gene using a drug. And so a bunch of analysts came in on a Saturday to try to work through the mediKanren results. And it turned out that all the papers they looked at had to do with treating back pain in horses. And so why was this? And it turns out that for each human gene, there are many possible names for that gene. One of the synonyms for that gene happened to be T13, which also means thoracic vertebra number 13, which humans don't have, but apparently horses do. And so the natural language processing system from which semantic medline database was created accidentally found this association. So, oh, okay, I found a synonym for this gene. And so this paper is making a claim about somehow treating diseases associated with the gene. It was actually about horse back pain. So those are the sorts of issues that we deal with, which are sort of nasty data issues. And as we've gotten additional data sources and additional knowledge graphs, and many of provided by other teams on this data translator consortium, we've been able to start double checking the types of data we have. But this is one of the big issues when you're dealing with biomedical knowledge as opposed to just data. So far, we're not really dealing so much with raw data. We're dealing with knowledge that has somehow been organized in the form of assertions, like imatinib treats cancer. Like a little sentence with a subject, a verb, and an object. And one of the good things about having that form of information is that we can reason over it relatively nicely from a mediKanren perspective. One of the downsides is you have to somehow wrestle the original data into that form, and every time you do a layer of translation or anything like that, you have the opportunity to introduce an error, or you have the problem of being able to talk about a concept and making sure you don't end up with like sort of least common denominator issues. So you spend a lot of time at the technical level worrying about like the names of concepts, making sure that the natural language processing data sets picked up on the right concept. Now we have data that knowledge structured in ontologies like gene ontology, we can start double checking some of the assertions made in the natural language processing data sets against knowledge that has been hand curated. And so this is one of the things that we've been working on this summer, is to start doing the double checking. Okay, so the Biolink data model is the format in which our knowledge graphs adhere in terms of the identifiers, these queries, and so forth. We also have to have a way to represent the raw information. And so there's a process by which we can ingest large data graphs or knowledge graphs. And it probably isn't a big surprise that what we do is we turn those into Racket representation. And if I look at some of the data we have in mediKanren, this is an example of one of the directories containing data from what's called the orange source of the orange knowledge graph. Greg Rosenblatt put in a tremendous amount of engineering to try to make these representations of the data very fast to reason over. So that was one of the big questions. Normally when thinking about mediKanren, I think of mediKanren as small data, maybe lots of computations, but relatively small data, small number of rules, things like that. Here we're talking about having maybe 1 billion facts in the forms of assertions about medicine. And at some point, we'll probably have hundreds of billions of facts or trillions of facts. And that was a big question, is whether or not we'd be able to scale that up using Racket and using mediKanren. And it turns out that you can. So basically, Greg created a novel graph database, which we call, well, I call GregDB. And so this graph database includes indexing, where the indexes are loaded into RAM, but the actual data is not loaded into RAM. The raw data is not loaded into RAM. And we can look at some of the information available. So for example, we have the categories of concepts we can talk about. And you can see that we have a string, we have a bunch of strings, but these are effectively S expressions. The file size is quite large. When we're dealing with the raw data for the concepts, we have effectively have a vector representation. We're representing this information as vectors, and the indexes have the ability to jump into any point in the large files that are vector, basically representing giant vectors on disk, usually a solid state drive. We can use the index to jump directly to any point within the files, and Racket's fairly fast at that. So if you have the data sets represented as vectors on a solid state drive, turns out we can jump to those points and call read and just read in the data very quickly, and the graph database performs quite well. And in fact, one of the things that surprised me was that some other teams who were running into scalability issues at one point expressed interest in switching from Python plus Java to Racket plus mediKanren because our code was so fast, which I never thought I'd hear that, but we have been able to add a bunch of optimizations given the type of data we have. And to answer Dimitri's question, why did we decide to use Racket? And why did we decide to use mediKanren as opposed to something else? We could have used Datalog, we could have used SQL, we could have used a graph database like Neo4j. And the main reason is that we understand mediKanren completely. The implementation is very short. Because we are able to modify the implementation, given our particular needs, we can easily change mediKanren. In fact, we have changed mediKanren in various ways in order to make it work better for this project. And we can do things like build a graph database in a small number of lines of code and hook it directly up to mediKanren. So that's the main reason, is that it allows us to control everything, given that when this project began, there were lots of uncertainties, and there still are some uncertainties about the project. So we wanted to make sure we weren't going to get stuck in a corner. If you look at the data representation for the Arch knowledge graph, if I look at the actual concepts, if I can call head on concepts.scm, we can see that we have a vector representing information here. We have a query, which is one of these URL, a shortened URL or URIs. So this is a query representing a disease from the human phenotype ontology, or disease phenotype. And here is a string telling us about that particular disease. And then we can get information about where it's provided and so forth. This graph database is split into different aspects. So we have concepts, we have edges. So basically we're going to have nodes and edges, and the nodes are going to be concepts representing, you can think of it as sort of nouns, or usually they're nouns from biology or medicine or what have you. Okay, so we have a custom graph database, and a lot of engineering has gone into making that fast, and that's one of our pieces of secret sauce that makes mediKanren good. All right, and that of course is all based on the Biolink compatible aspects of the project. And here is a query that Nada has shown before, showed in the PLMW workshop. So this is sort of our a good example of the sorts of things that the NIH and CATS would like us to be able to do. So this is a drug repurposing query for trying to figure out whether or not imatinib might treat asthma, and it shows you the graph formalism that we have, and we have things like KIT gene causes mast cell activation. Those are our triples. Okay. Once you have these triples, you could think of this in terms of semantic, semantic web RDF triples, and there's a lot of semantic web interface on the project. Those are the sorts of things that, the semantic web people care about this. People who care about graph databases, they like these sorts of formalisms. People coming from the more traditional, relational database format, I think maybe feel that this is a little more unusual. From a research problem standpoint, I think there's an interesting opportunity, which I've seen come up on the project, which is that we are constantly pulling in different types of data. So there's data that's represented in comma-separated value files or TSV files, tab-separated value files. You have the semantic web endpoints, and you have RDF, triple stores, and things like that. We have relational databases, sort of this traditional SQL style databases, and we have various graph databases that exist like Neo4j. And one of the things I've noticed that people working in bioinformatics or computational biology spend a lot of time doing is trying to wrangle with the data in these various forms. Another thing I've noticed is that mediKanren, seems to handle data in a very flexible way. So for example, if you're doing RDF, everything has to be in triples. And if you're using a relational database, normally for a certain table, everything has to be the right size, and there are all sorts of restrictions maybe on how you can do recursion and so forth. Graph databases, a similar sort of thing. There are usually various limitations on what you're allowed to express. And what I've noticed is that for most of the forms of data and most of the forms of reasoning we've run into, we can actually express those directly in mediKanren, which has made me wonder, instead of trying to go through all the work of massaging the underlying data stores to all be in one format, which is what usually seems to happen. Like, okay, we're going to use a graph database for everything, or we're going to use everything's going to be a relational database. We'll suck it into a SQL database. Would it be interesting, and would there be a research possibility and a tool building possibility of using something like mediKanren and being able to natively handle all the underlying formats? And would that allow you to write queries that in some sense had less impedance mismatch than when you try to take data in a graph database and stick it into a relational database, for example, or whatever transformations are going on. So that's something that I have been thinking about, is there may be some opportunity to try to use the flexibility of mediKanren to avoid the problem of having to stick all your data into one type of format. Maybe we can keep it in the format that we want to have around. A lot of the engineering on the project has to do with the scale of the knowledge graphs and also the heterogeneity of the knowledge graphs. This is a map drawn by MD PhD student Michael Patton of RTX2 knowledge graphs. This is one of the big knowledge graphs that we've gotten from Steve Ramsey's team at Oregon State University. And you can see, this isn't a map showing the data, this is a map showing the types of data and the connections. And so RTX2 probably has something like 40 different databases that are tied together, and we have different concept ideas. So there are many different notions of just identifiers for genes, for example, in the RTX2 knowledge graph. And so we have to be able to traverse this sort of map in order to say, okay, if I'm given an NCBI gene, how am I going to somehow connect that to a drug that treats the disease, or drug safety information and so forth. So traversing these knowledge graphs is not trivial. And this is an area where I've thought that maybe something like type inference could help. Unfortunately, the type information, the category information on the drugs, or sorry, on the concepts we have isn't very reliable. But with an improved category information, I think, sort of the type inference or type code that we write in functional and relational programming might be useful for helping navigate through the system. One of the things that has happened recently is Kat Zhang has, one of Nada Min's students at Harvard has been working with Greg Rosenblatt and has been working on tools to automatically create these knowledge graphs by hand. So this is a knowledge graph that Michael Patton created by hand, and here is the version that Kat was able to create automatically. We're still working on trying to do the layout to make that nicer, but being able to automatically generate these knowledge graphs almost immediately is very important, because the knowledge graphs are such complicated artifacts that I thought, the code would be complicated on the project. It turns out that the most complicated thing is usually trying to understand the connections between this data, especially when these data are represented so many different ways. So a lot of the time we spend is trying to do archaeology to try to uncover the structure of these knowledge graphs. And I think there's a lot of reasoning that has to happen just at that level. Let's see. Okay. All right, so I talked about quite a few things, and one thing I'd like to say is that we have been working this summer with Joseph Cottom and Jeremy Zucker at Pacific Northwest Laboratory, and we've been a national laboratory, and along with NADA students, we've been exploring truth maintenance systems and also causal reasoning and counterfactual reasoning. So I'm hoping that we'll have a whole bunch of very interesting reasoning, much of which came out of sort of the symbolic AI reasoning from the MIT lab where Scheme came out in the 70s and 80s. I hope we will be applying that as well soon.